A lot of people think watercolor is difficult, but there are plenty of simple beginner-friendly techniques that create stunning results without endless layering or complicated blending. One of my favorites is blooming, a technique that uses just one pigment and clear water to create soft, effortless textures. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to paint a beautiful rose using blooming technique, plus a few tricks and color options to make the effect even stronger. It works like magic, and if you're ever struggled with watercolor, this might just change everything. No need for perfect brush control, no tricky layering, no overworking your paper. Just let the water do the work. And if you're a more experienced artist like me, this is a wonderful, relaxing exercise for your sketchbook or when you have just under an hour to create something beautiful. Let's go through this step by step using this red rose as an example and talk about 5 key considerations to help you achieve the best results. The first and most important factor is your paper. The blooming technique works best on 100% cotton, cold-pressed paper, not hot-pressed. Cold-pressed paper dries more slowly, giving you plenty of time to manipulate the pigment and water, and the texture enhances the beautiful organic effect created by the blooming technique. For this tutorial, I'll be painting in my favorite square sketchbook, which I designed in collaboration with Etcher. It's perfect for practice because it features 3 different types of paper, including both cold-pressed and hot-pressed, all in one book, making it excellent for watercolor practice. It will be available starting March 1st, and I'll leave a link in the video description below if you like to check it out. But no matter what paper you use, just make sure it's 100% cotton, cold-pressed for the best results. The link to the photo reference is also in the video description below. If you like to skip the sketching step and jump straight into painting, the black and white outline and real-time recording of this tutorial will be available on my Patreon channel. To start, I'm placing my palette on the right side of my sketchbook so you can see it clearly, and for now I'm just using one pigment, Rhodonite Genuine from Daniel Smith. I begin with one of the largest petals, first wetting it completely with clear water, and then with a small amount of paint on the tip of my brush, I outline the petal border. Watch how the color naturally moves towards the center. This is a classic watercolor effect, and you can put a little bit of extra paint in the middle. The pigment will flow to the wettest areas, leaving behind crisp, defined edges. Now to create a blooming effect, I clean my brush, load it with clear water, and place a few drops right in the center of the petal. The moment the water touches the paint, it pushes the pigment outward, creating very soft, radiating textures, almost like ripples in the water. As I move to the next petal, you'll notice the bloom effect continues to develop, slowly spreading over the next couple of minutes. For this petal, I skip the clear water base and go straight in with diluted paint. It's just another option to try. When I drop in water this time, the blooming effect is even more dramatic, with beautiful feathering around each drop. Now, here's another important tip. You might be tempted to paint the petal right next to the one you just worked on, but don't do it. Watercolor blooms need space. If 2 wet areas touch, the paint will spread unpredictably and you will lose that crisp bloom effect. Instead, work on non-adjacent petals first, like I'm doing here, so they can fully dry before you paint the ones beside them. This prevents unwanted paint bleeding and allows each bloom to form naturally. And at this stage I've painted about 5 petals, letting each one bloom with added water drops. Now I need to pause and let the rose dry before moving on to the next set of petals. And you can speed things up with a hairdryer, but I prefer to switch to another painting while I wait. This time I'm working on yellow roses, which I will show you in the next video, so don't forget to subscribe. And I highly recommend having a second or maybe even third painting on hand, so you can always keep creating while waiting for your paint to dry. Now that the first set of petals are dry, you can see how the paint has settled, creating beautiful texture and distinct dark outlines around each segment. Since I'm using 100% cotton paper, which is highly absorbent and dries unevenly, the pigment naturally gathers at the edges of the water, forming a soft yet very defined 3-dimensional effect, all without any extra effort on my part. Even though I didn't manually outline each petal or spend time layering and blending, blending to build contrast, the result has a very natural variation in values, lighter areas in the center and deep red edges around each petal. This is what makes the blooming technique so magical. It's completely effortless, quick, and works beautifully even if you're new to watercolor. As I continue adding petals, you'll see the rose slowly come to life. Now, the key to mastering blooms is water control. If your surface is too dry, the bloom won't spread. If it's too wet, you will lose definition. But when you find that perfect balance, the results are stunning. So here is my next important tip. Give your paint a few seconds to settle before adding water drops. Your surface should be damp, not soaking wet. The larger the petal, the more water you can add, allowing the bloom to spread beautifully without overpowering the shape. Mastering this balance takes a little bit of practice, but once you get the feel for it, you'll be able to create gorgeous organic textures effortlessly. So let's keep going even further. Now that our petals are taking shape, let's add more depth and interest by introducing color variation and some greenery. You're not limited to just one color. Notice how I've blended a touch of yellow into the base of the central petal, adding warmth and dimension. And while those petals are drying out, let's switch to the leaves and see how this blooming effect works with greenery. I'm using Green Apatite Genuine, a gorgeous super granulating pigment from Daniel Smith. Just like before, I'm covering the leaf segment with diluted wash first, then adding a few drops of clear water to create organic, unpredictable texture. To enhance the color variation, I'm also blending a touch of brown matter near the tips, introducing a subtle contrast that makes the green feel even more interesting. For now, I'm focusing on the stem and a lower part of the leaves. Remember, we need to let the segments dry completely before painting the areas next to them, so I'll come back in a few minutes to finish the top portion. Let's do the last set of petals, adding depth and dimension with subtle shadows. I will be focusing on the bottom left petal, layering some soft pink in the deepest shadow area near the base. And then just as before, I will add a drop of water to bring out even more texture. A bit of gentle layering can always make a big difference if you're looking to enhance realism. And if you're interested in exploring this effect further, there are plenty of ways to build on this technique. I will show it to you in just a minute. Now I'll return to the leaves and layer the top portion with Cascade Green, another beautifully granulating pigment. This brings us to tip number 4 for mastering watercolor blooms. It's choosing the right pigments. If you want your blooms to be more bold and striking, you want to opt for granulating watercolors. These pigments contain larger, heavier particles that naturally settle into rich, textured patterns when activated with water. Mineral-based colors, like this Rhodonite Genuine from Daniel Smith that I used on the petals, are also very effective in creating distinct organic textures because, once again, the particles are quite heavy and move very easily when you add those drops of water. On the other hand, if you're using non-granulating pigments, your blooms will appear much smoother and more delicate, still beautiful, just with a softer, more subtle effect. Understanding how different pigments behave will help you control and enhance your blooms, giving your painting even more depth and character. I talk a lot about this aspect of watercolors, granulating versus non-granulating, in my new book. It just came out and it's already #1 in art encyclopedias on Amazon. I'm so excited and grateful for your support. It has a ton of information on different categories of watercolor pigments and how you can use them in your work to enhance different techniques. I hope it will be a valuable resource for everyone who loves watercolor for years to come. Once everything is fully dry, we have a beautiful rose, and it only took me about 30 minutes of painting time, not counting the drying breaks. If you want to enhance the look even more, you can add delicate shadows for extra depth. Here are some of my favorite reddish tones for layering. I started with more pink Quinacridone red, then switched to warmer Quinacridone Scarlet. It has those subtle brown undertones, giving me more of a dry petal look. Both pigments are very subtle when mixed with lots of water, just enough to give a sense of shadow and dimension on the larger petals. And if you feel like adding much darker accents, Perylene Violet is one of my all-time favorite shadow colors for botanical art, allowing me to create the darkest accents and the deepest shadows. Just make sure to use lots of water on the second layer to keep your shadows transparent so you don't obscure the beautiful blooms underneath. The fascinating thing about blooming effect is that beginners often think about it as a mistake, something unwanted which happens by accident, maybe if you splash some water on freshly painted surface. But in reality, if you plan it and use it with purpose, it can be your greatest strength, allowing you to add depth, movement, and so much texture to your watercolor painting in ways that no other medium can replicate. The best part, it's so easy and so quick. But if you like to take your botanical watercolor even further, check out my more advanced tutorial where we build up to 4 or even 5 layers of color, capturing realistic glowing light, rich depth, and soft petal shadows on the rose.